Grand Canyon Caves, White Lady. Since the 1920s, hikers have reported seeing a mysterious woman near the Grand Canyon Caves. The sightings happen most often near the cave entrances and limestone overhangs of the North Rim. The spirit is known by two names, the White Lady and the Wailing Woman. Marjorie Woodruff was a naturalist and explorer who spent years studying the Grand Canyon. Her nickname was Slim because of her tall, thin build. Woodruff was one of the first people to document encounters with the White Lady. She was hiking through the rocky recesses near the cave systems one afternoon. As she walked deeper into the canyon, she heard something following behind her. The sound was rhythmic, heavy footsteps echoing off the limestone walls. Woodruff stopped walking to listen more carefully. The footsteps stopped at the exact same moment she did. When she started walking again, the footsteps resumed immediately. Someone or something was matching her pace perfectly. Woodruff turned around multiple times but never saw anyone on the trail behind her. Many witnesses have also seen the White Lady with their own eyes. She appears as a woman wearing a long white dress decorated with blue flowers. Her dress looks old-fashioned, like clothing from the early 1900s. The blue flowers on her dress are vivid and stand out against the white fabric. One explorer had a particularly strange encounter inside one of the caves. He was examining a shallow pool of water on the cave floor. As he looked down at the water, he saw a woman's face reflected in the surface. The reflection showed a pale woman with dark hair wearing a white dress. The explorer spun around quickly to see who was standing behind him. But no one was there in the cave passage. He was completely alone in that section of the cave. The reflection had vanished from the water when he looked back down. As he started to leave, something caught his eye on a nearby ledge. A single fresh blue flower was lying on the dry rock surface. The ledge was deep inside the cave where sunlight never reaches. No plants could possibly grow in that dark, dry environment. The flower looked freshly picked, as if someone had just placed it there moments before. The explorer carefully examined the cave but found no explanation for the mysterious flower. Sightings of the White Lady continue to this day at the Grand Canyon Caves. The identity of the woman in white and why she haunts the caves remains a mystery. Welsh Sump Phantom Hand Rescue. In the early 2000s, a cave diver explored a dangerous underwater passage in Wales. He was an experienced diver who had completed many cave dives before. The section he was entering was called a sump. A sump is a passage that is completely filled with water from floor to ceiling. This particular sump was only about 3 feet long and 2 feet deep. It seemed like a simple, quick dive to reach the next dry section. The diver took a deep breath and entered the cold water. He began swimming through the narrow underwater passage. Suddenly, his cave suit caught on a sharp rock jutting from the wall. He was stuck underwater and could not move forward or backward. The diver tried desperately to free himself from the snag. The water in the cave was absolutely freezing cold. Within moments, he began to feel the early stages of hypothermia setting in. His body temperature was dropping dangerously fast. Panic started to take over as he realized he was trapped alone. His team members were waiting on the other side of the sump. They had no way to reach him or even know he was in trouble. The freezing water was draining his strength with every passing second. He felt himself getting weaker and more disoriented from the cold. Then something impossible happened in the dark water. The diver felt a distinct physical hand press firmly down on his head. The hand was solid and real, not his imagination. A strong grip suddenly grabbed his diving suit from behind. The hand pulled him forcefully backward out of the water with incredible strength. He emerged from the sump gasping for air and shaking from cold. When he looked down at his cave suit, he saw something shocking. The fabric was ripped exactly where the invisible hand had grabbed him. The tear in the suit showed the physical force that had pulled him free. He turned around to thank whoever had rescued him from drowning. But he was completely alone in that section of the cave. His team members were still on the other side of the sump where he had left them. No living person could have reached him in time to pull him out. The phantom hand had saved his life when hypothermia and panic would have killed him. The incident was verified by members of the British caving community who investigated his story. The hand on the head became one of the most famous paranormal rescue stories in cave diving history, Cudjo's cave ghost encounter. During the mid-20th century, a young man visited Cudjo's cave on the Virginia and Tennessee border. He was exploring the historic cave system that had been used during the Civil War era. As the hours passed, he realized he had stayed in the cave much longer than planned. Darkness fell outside, and he found himself trapped inside until morning. The young man decided to save his flashlight batteries by sitting in complete darkness. He huddled against the cold cave wall to wait out the long night. The cave was silent, except for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Suddenly, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps, crunching on the gravel path. The footsteps were getting closer, and closer to where he sat. He quickly turned on his flashlight to see who was approaching. A tall man appeared in the beam of light walking toward him. The man looked to be in his 40s, and wore a battered straw hat on his head. His clothes were ragged canvas. That hung loosely on his thin frame. The stranger was limping badly as he walked down the cave passage. The young visitor noticed something shocking about the man's body. There was a large, jagged wound in his abdomen. That looked terrible. But the wound was not bleeding at all, and not even a single drop. The man continued walking closer despite his serious injury. Then the visitor noticed something even more disturbing. The man had no shadow on the cave wall behind him. The flashlight beam passed completely through his body and hit the wall. The figure was not solid like a living person should be. The spirit stopped and looked directly at the frightened young man. He spoke in a quiet voice and said his name was Enos. Enos explained that he had been an escaped slave. During the Civil War era, he had hidden in Cudjo's cave to avoid being captured and returned to slavery. But looters had discovered him in the cave and murdered him for whatever he carried. Enos pointed to a specific spot on the cave floor near where they stood. He said that was the exact location where he had been shot and killed. After pointing out the murder site, the spirit of Enos simply vanished into thin air. The young man was left alone again in the darkness of the cave. He kept his flashlight on for the rest of the night, too frightened to turn it off. The ghost of Enos became one of the most famous paranormal legends in the cave systems of Virginia and Tennessee. Mammoth Cave Phantom Choir. Since the 1840s, tour guides at Mammoth Cave have reported hearing mysterious music. The sounds come from a massive chamber called the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church chamber got its name because it was once used for real religious services. In the 1800s, people held prayer meetings and sang hymns in this enormous underground room. The ceiling of the chamber rises 80 feet above the floor. The acoustics in the space are perfect for voices and music to echo beautifully. But the religious services ended over a century ago. Today, the Methodist Church chamber is just an empty cave room on the tour route. However, tour guides continue to hear something impossible in that chamber. During routine inspections, they report hearing the sound of singing. One guide was walking through the cave alone doing his daily safety check. As he approached the Methodist Church chamber, he heard music echoing through the passages. It sounded like a full choir singing together in perfect harmony. The hymn was an old song from the 19th century. The guide recognized it as the type of religious music sung during the 1800 services. He assumed a group of tourists must be practicing or having a special event. The guide followed the sound to find out who was in the chamber. As he got closer, the singing grew louder and more beautiful. The voices filled the entire cave with their melody. When he entered the Methodist Church chamber, the music was at full volume. The hymn echoed magnificently off the 80-foot ceiling above. The guide looked around the massive room, expecting to see a large group of people, but the chamber was completely empty. There was not a single person standing anywhere in the room. The guide stood in shock as the invisible choir continued singing around him. He walked to the center of the chamber to listen more carefully. The moment he reached the middle of the floor, something strange happened. The music did not gradually fade away like normal sound. Instead, it simply cut out instantly, as if someone had stopped a recording. 1 second, the choir was singing at full volume. The next second, there was total silence. The guide searched every corner of the Methodist Church chamber. He found no speakers, no hidden tourists, and no explanation for what he heard. Many other guides have reported hearing the same phantom choir over the years. The spirits of the 19th century worshippers seem to continue their services in the darkness. The Phantom Choir of Mammoth Cave remains one of the most famous paranormal phenomena in American cave systems. Cave Kenny Veach Disappearance. In 2014, a YouTuber named Kenny Veach made a disturbing comment on a cave exploration video. Kenny's YouTube channel was called SnakeBitMG. He wrote that he had found a strange cave entrance near Area 51 in Nevada. The cave opening was shaped like the letter M. Kenny described something terrifying that happened when he approached the M-shaped entrance. His entire body began to vibrate with an intense, unexplainable energy. The vibration was so powerful and frightening that he turned around and left immediately. He did not enter the cave because the sensation felt wrong and dangerous. Other YouTube users read Kenny's comment and were skeptical about his story. They challenged him to go back and find the M cave again. Some commenters dared him to film the cave and prove it was real. Kenny accepted the challenge and decided to search for the mysterious cave. He made his first filmed attempt to relocate the M-shaped entrance. During this trip, Kenny hiked through the desert mountains near Area 51 for hours. He searched everywhere but could not find the exact location of the M cave. Kenny returned home unsuccessful but determined to keep looking. In November 2014, Kenny told his family he was going out for a short hike. He planned to search for the M cave one more time. Kenny packed his gear and headed into the Nevada desert alone. His family expected him to return home later that same day, but Kenny Veach never came back from that hike. Hours turned into days and Kenny was still missing. His worried family immediately contacted the authorities. Search and rescue teams were sent into the desert to look for him. The search teams covered miles of harsh desert terrain near Area 51. They checked caves, mine shafts, and rocky areas where Kenny might have gone. Eventually, the searchers made a disturbing discovery. They found Kenny's cell phone lying on the ground near an abandoned mine shaft. The phone was the only trace of Kenny that was ever found. Search teams explored the mine shaft thoroughly but found no sign of Kenny. Despite extensive searches over many days, Kenny Veach was never found. His body has never been recovered from the desert. To this day, no one knows what happened to Kenny Veach. Serbian bear den's social media stunt. In late 2024, a Serbian influencer posted a shocking video on social media. The video was titled, "On the Edge of Life." It showed him crawling into what looked like a wild bear's den. The influencer wanted to create dramatic content to gain followers and views. He approached a dark cave-like hole in the ground. The opening appeared to be a natural bear den in the wilderness. The influencer turned on his camera and began crawling slowly into the hole. Inside the den, everything was pitch black and silent. He kept filming as he moved deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, a massive bear emerged from the shadows right in front of him. The enormous animal was just inches away from the influencer's face. The bear leaned forward and began sniffing the terrified man. The influencer remained completely frozen in fear. He did not move a single muscle as the bear investigated him. The bear's hot breath and massive size were captured clearly on camera. The video ended with the influencer backing out of the den slowly. He posted the video online with a dramatic title suggesting he had risked his life. The video went viral immediately and received millions of views. People around the world watched in shock as the influencer encountered the bear. Many viewers believed he had actually crawled into a wild bear's den. However, the truth came out soon after the video spread across social media. The den was not a wild bear's home in the forest. It was actually part of a bear sanctuary facility. The bear in the video was a rescue animal named Masho. Masho was accustomed to being around humans because of his rescue background. The bear was not a dangerous wild animal hunting in the forest. The entire video had been staged to look more dangerous than it really was. When people learned the truth, massive backlash erupted against the influencer. Critics accused him of engagement farming to get clicks and followers. Engagement farming means creating fake or exaggerated content just for attention. Wildlife experts condemned the video for sending a terrible message to viewers. The stunt encouraged followers to approach dangerous wildlife for social media content. Even though the influencer survived without a scratch, his actions were reckless. Real wild bears are incredibly dangerous and will attack humans who invade their dens. Approaching a wild bear's den is one of the most deadly mistakes a person can make. Spanish Cave 500-Day Isolation Experiment. In 2021, elite athlete and mountaineer Beatriz Flamini entered a cave in Spain. She was about to begin one of the most extreme isolation experiments ever attempted. The cave was located 230 feet underground, deep beneath the surface. Flamini volunteered to stay alone in the cave with no human contact. A production company was documenting her journey for a scientific study. The goal was to understand what happens to the human mind during extreme isolation. Flamini brought supplies, books, and painting materials to occupy her time. She had no clock, no calendar, and no way to track the passage of time. The cave had no natural light from the sun. She lived in complete darkness except for artificial lights she controlled. There were no sounds from the outside world in the deep underground chamber. Flamini could not hear birds, traffic, voices, or any normal daily sounds. She was cut off from all human interaction in modern life. The isolation experiment was supposed to last for 500 days. As weeks turned into months, Flamini began to experience strange effects. Her brain started playing tricks on her in the silent darkness. She heard auditory hallucinations that sounded real but were not there. Voices and sounds appeared in her mind from the extreme isolation. Without any way to track time, she completely lost her sense of days and weeks. Time became meaningless in the unchanging environment of the cave. Flamini painted, read books, and exercised to keep her mind and body active. But the psychological effects of total isolation grew stronger over time. After 512 days underground, the experiment finally came to an end. A team arrived at the cave to bring Beatrice Flamini back to the surface. When they told her it was time to leave, she admitted something shocking. Flamini said she did not want to come out of the cave. She had adapted so completely to isolation that returning felt wrong. The team helped her climb back up to the surface world. Emerging from the cave after 512 days was extremely difficult for her. The bright sunlight hurt her eyes after living in darkness for so long. The sounds of the modern world were overwhelming and painful to hear. Flamini's psychological state was fragile after the extreme isolation. Krubera Cave Extreme Depth Expedition. In late 2024, Turkish YouTuber Ruhi Çenet prepared for the most dangerous journey of his life. Ruhi was known for creating high-production documentary videos about extreme locations. He decided to explore Krubera Cave in Georgia, the deepest known cave on Earth. Krubera Cave descends an incredible 7,296 feet below the surface. Ruhi knew this expedition would be far more dangerous than anything he had attempted before. Unlike casual influencers who take quick risks, Ruhi spent over a year training. He prepared his body and mind for the extreme conditions deep underground. Professional cave divers and experts taught him the technical skills he would need. Before the expedition could begin, Ruhi had to sign a serious legal contract. The contract acknowledged that rescue was virtually impossible if something went wrong. If he became trapped or injured at extreme depth, no one could save him. He accepted this risk and signed the document anyway. In early 2025, Ruhi and his team entered Krubera Cave to begin the descent. The journey would take 8 full days in total darkness. They carried all their food, water, and equipment on their backs. The team navigated through vertical pits that dropped hundreds of feet straight down. They rappelled down ropes into pitch-black abysses with no bottom in sight. Freezing cold water poured over them in many sections of the cave. The water temperature was near 0 degrees Celsius. As they descended deeper, the air became thinner and harder to breathe. Oxygen-deprived passages made every movement exhausting and difficult. The physical toll on Ruhi's body was extreme. He could barely eat or sleep in the harsh underground conditions. His muscles ached constantly from climbing and carrying heavy gear. The mental pressure of being trapped miles underground was overwhelming. Every day, the team pushed deeper into the Earth's crust. By the time they reached the deepest point, they were over 2 kilometers below the surface. The return journey back to the surface was just as grueling as going down. After 8 days underground, Ruhi finally emerged from Krubera Cave. He had lost 22 pounds of body weight. His body was suffering from severe physical exhaustion. The mental toll was just as serious as the physical damage. Ruhi posted his documentary video on YouTube shortly after the expedition. The video garnered over 10 million views almost instantly. People around the world watched in shock at the extreme depths he had reached. The expedition was successful and everyone returned safely. Bushman's Hole, Deep Dive Recovery Death. On January 8, 2005, world-class diver Dave Shaw prepared for an extremely dangerous mission. He was at Bushman's Hole, a deep underwater cave in South Africa. 10 years earlier, another diver named Dion Dreyer had died in the same cave. Dion Dreyer's body had sunk to the bottom at 886 feet deep. At 886 feet, the water pressure is crushing and deadly. Very few divers in the world have the skills to reach such extreme depths. Dave Shaw was one of the most experienced technical divers alive. He had successfully completed many deep dives that other divers considered impossible. Shaw decided he would try to recover Dion Dreyer's body and bring it to the surface. He wanted to give Dion's family closure after 10 years of waiting. Shaw knew this would be the most dangerous dive of his entire career. He attached a small camera to his diving helmet to record the recovery. The camera would document every moment of the dive for safety and training purposes. Shaw entered the water and began his descent into Bushman's Hole. The deeper he went, the darker and colder the water became. At extreme depth, every movement must be slow and careful. After many minutes of descending, Shaw reached the bottom at 886 feet. His helmet camera recorded him finding Dion Dreyer's body in the darkness. Shaw began working to secure the body so he could bring it up. As he worked, something went terribly wrong. Shaw became entangled in a nylon line attached to the body. The line wrapped around his equipment and body in the freezing water. He tried to free himself, but the entanglement only got worse. The footage from his helmet camera shows his breathing becoming faster and faster. At extreme depth, breathing too rapidly causes carbon dioxide to build up in the blood. Carbon dioxide buildup makes a diver confused, panicked, and unable to think clearly. Shaw's breathing continued to accelerate as the CO2 poisoning took hold. The camera recorded 17 minutes of his struggle in total darkness. His movements became slower and less coordinated as the poison affected his brain. Eventually, Dave Shaw lost consciousness from the carbon dioxide buildup. He passed out while still entangled 886 feet below the surface. Dave Shaw never regained consciousness and died in Bushman's Hole. His body sank back to the bottom along with Dion Dreyer's remains. Plura Cave Diving Tragedy. On February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish divers arrived at Plura Cave in Norway. The cave system was completely flooded with ice-cold water. The divers were experienced technical cave divers who had trained for years. Their plan was to swim through the underwater cave passages together. The dive would take them over 100 meters deep into the flooded cave. At that depth, the water pressure is extreme and dangerous. The divers wore GoPro cameras on their helmets to document the expedition. They entered the freezing water and began swimming into the dark cave system. The passages started out wide but became narrower as they went deeper. At over 100 meters deep, they reached an extremely tight section. The narrow passage was barely wide enough for a diver to squeeze through. 2 of the Finnish divers attempted to swim through the narrow gap. Without warning, both divers became wedged in the tight passage. Their diving equipment got stuck against the rocks on all sides. They could not move forward or backward through the restriction. The trapped divers began to panic as they realized they were stuck. The other 3 divers tried desperately to help free their friends, but the passage was so narrow that only one person could fit at a time. Working in the confined space at extreme depth was almost impossible. Time was running out as the trapped divers' air supply ran low. Despite all efforts to save them, both wedged divers died in the passage. Their bodies remained stuck over 100 meters deep in the flooded cave. The 3 surviving divers had no choice but to leave their friends behind. They made the agonizing swim back to the surface alone. The GoPro cameras had captured the chaos of the initial accident. The footage showed the moment the divers became wedged and the failed rescue attempts. The surviving divers were devastated by the loss of their friends. Norwegian authorities said the bodies were too deep to recover safely. The official position was that the 2 divers would remain in the cave forever. But the 3 survivors could not accept leaving their friends in the darkness. They decided to conduct a secret, unauthorized recovery mission. Without telling authorities, they returned to Plura Cave weeks later. The survivors brought their GoPro cameras again to film everything. They dove back down over 100 meters to where their friends had died. The recovery process was incredibly dangerous and emotionally devastating. They had to carefully free the bodies from the narrow passage. Every moment at that extreme depth risked their own lives. After hours of difficult work, they successfully recovered both bodies. The survivors brought their friends back to the surface and to their families. The entire unauthorized recovery mission was captured on their helmet cameras. Blue Hole Yuri Lipski death. On April 28, 2000, diving instructor Yuri Lipski arrived at the Blue Hole in Egypt. The Blue Hole is a massive underwater sinkhole in the Red Sea. While it is technically a sinkhole, the ceiling and walls create a cave-like environment. The Blue Hole is one of the most dangerous dive sites in the world. Hundreds of divers have died in this location over the years. Yuri Lipski was an experienced diving instructor who knew the risks. He decided to attempt what divers call a bounce dive. A bounce dive means descending rapidly to extreme depth and returning quickly. Lipski planned to dive alone to the bottom of the Blue Hole. The bottom was over 295 feet deep. He carried a handheld camera to record his dive. Lipski entered the water and began his rapid descent into the blue abyss. The camera recorded his view as he dropped deeper and deeper. The walls of the sinkhole surrounded him on all sides like a cave. As he descended past 165 feet, the danger zone began. At extreme depth, nitrogen in a diver's air supply becomes toxic to the brain. This condition is called nitrogen narcosis, and it feels like being drunk. Divers with nitrogen narcosis cannot think clearly or make good decisions. They become confused, disoriented, and unable to judge danger properly. Lipski continued descending rapidly past 230 feet, then 260 feet. The camera shows he was dropping far too fast for a safe dive. By the time he reached over 295 feet, the nitrogen narcosis had taken full effect. His brain was severely impaired by the toxic nitrogen in his blood. At the bottom of the blue hole, Lipski realized something was terribly wrong. The camera captured his frantic movements as panic set in. He tried desperately to inflate his buoyancy compensator device. The buoyancy compensator is a vest that helps divers float back to the surface. But Lipski was too confused and disoriented to operate his equipment correctly. His hands fumbled with the controls as the nitrogen narcosis clouded his mind. The footage shows his breathing becoming rapid and panicked. Every breath at that extreme depth consumed his limited air supply faster. Lipski tried over and over to inflate the vest and rise from the bottom. But his impaired brain could not coordinate the simple actions needed. Time was running out as his air supply dropped critically low. The camera recorded his movements becoming slower and weaker. Eventually, Yuri Lipski collapsed on the seafloor at over 295 feet deep. He'd lost consciousness from the combination of nitrogen narcosis and air depletion. Yuri Lipski died alone on the bottom of the blue hole. His body was recovered days later along with his handheld camera. The camera had recorded every moment of his final dive. Tham Luang, Cave Rescue Mission. On June 23, 2018, 12 young soccer players and their coach entered Tham Luang Cave in Thailand. The boys were members of the Wild Boars soccer team. They planned to explore the cave for just a short time after practice. While they were inside, heavy monsoon rains began pouring down outside. The rain filled the cave passages with rushing floodwater. Within hours, the boys and their coach were trapped deep inside the cave. The flooded passages blocked their only way out to safety. News of the trapped soccer team spread across Thailand and then the entire world. Rescue teams from multiple countries rushed to Tham Luang Cave to help. Thai Navy SEALs arrived to lead the dangerous underwater rescue operation. Expert cave divers from Britain, Australia, and other nations joined the mission. The rescue divers brought GoPro cameras and helmet cams to document the conditions. They entered the flooded cave to search for the trapped boys. The water inside the cave had zero visibility from mud and sediment. The divers could not see anything in front of them in the murky water. They had to feel their way along guide ropes in complete darkness. The cave passages twisted through sections called the S-curve. These narrow, flooded passages were extremely dangerous to navigate. The divers had to squeeze through tight restrictions while underwater. One wrong move could trap a diver or cause them to lose their air supply. After 9 days of searching, British divers Rick Stanton and John Valanthan made an incredible discovery. Their helmet cameras captured the moment they found all 13 people alive. The boys and their coach were huddled on a small, dry ledge deep in the cave. They had survived for 9 days without food in complete darkness. The world celebrated that they were alive, but the rescue mission was just beginning. Getting the boys out through the flooded passages would be extremely dangerous. Thai Navy SEAL Saman Kunan volunteered to help with the rescue operation. He was a former SEAL who came out of retirement to save the trapped boys. Saman Kunan's job was to deliver oxygen tanks to stations along the rescue route. The divers needed these oxygen supplies to make the long journey through the flooded cave. On July 6, 2018, Saman Kunan was swimming back through the cave after delivering tanks. He was alone in the dark, flooded passage when something went wrong. Saman Kunan ran out of air and lost consciousness underwater. By the time other divers found him, it was too late. Saman Kunan died in Tham Luang Cave while trying to save the 13 trapped people. Despite the tragedy, the rescue operation continued. The team developed a plan to sedate the boys and carry them through the water. Expert cave divers guided each unconscious boy through the deadly passages. Over 3 days, all 12 boys and their coach were successfully rescued. Snake Palace Cave Python Attack. Brady Barr and his team traveled to a remote cave in Thailand to study wildlife. The cave was known locally as the Snake Palace because of the massive number of pythons living inside. The cave was home to thousands of reticulated pythons that hunted in the darkness. Before entering, Brady knew this would be one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The air inside the cave was filled with ammonia gas from decomposing bat guano. The toxic fumes made it almost impossible to breathe without protection. Brady and his team had to wear respirators just to survive inside the cave. The floor was not solid ground like a normal cave. Instead, it was a liquid sludge made of fresh and ancient bat droppings mixed with water. Millions of cockroaches crawled through the disgusting black mud. The team had to crawl on their stomachs through the thick guano sludge to move forward. As Brady crawled through the narrow tunnel, a 12-foot reticulated python was hiding nearby. Reticulated pythons are specialized cave hunters that sense heat and vibrations. This massive snake was completely submerged in the black guano mud. Brady could not see the python because it was invisible beneath the dark sludge. As he crawled past the hidden predator, the python sensed his movement. Without warning, the snake exploded from the mud like a missile. The python's jaws latched onto Brady's lower leg with incredible force. Reticulated pythons have dozens of needle-sharp, recurved teeth. The moment the snake bit down, it began wrapping its powerful coils around Brady's leg. Brady tried to push away, but the slippery mud gave him no leverage. He was trapped in the narrow tunnel with a 12-foot python trying to constrict him. His team members rushed to help, but only one person could reach him in the tight space. They had to work quickly before the snake could wrap more coils around his body. The team knew they could not just pull the snake off Brady's leg. If they pulled too hard, the recurved teeth would act like fishhooks and shred his muscles. They had to physically pry open the python's jaws, tooth by tooth. Finally, they managed to free Brady from the python's deadly grip. His lower leg had deep puncture wounds from the snake's sharp teeth. The real danger was not just the bite itself. The guano mud Brady had been crawling through was essentially liquid bacteria. The risk of a life-threatening infection was extremely high. Brady had to be rushed out of the snake palace immediately for emergency medical treatment. Doctors had to disinfect his wounds completely to prevent deadly bacteria from entering his bloodstream. Black Mountain Cave, Jaguar standoff. During the intense heat of the Mexican dry season, a team of cavers explored the Sierra de la Libertad region. The area is known as the Black Mountains because of its dark, rugged limestone formations. The team was deep inside a cave system searching for new chambers. To reach the next chamber, they had to crawl through an extremely narrow passage. The ceiling was only 12 to 18 inches high in this section. This type of crawl is called a flat-out crawl because explorers must lie completely flat. In this position, a person cannot move quickly or use their arms for defense. They cannot even look up to see what is ahead. The cavers were completely vulnerable as they squeezed through the tight space. After crawling for some time, they finally emerged into a larger chamber. They were now 200 feet deep inside the mountain. The cavers turned on their LED headlamps to see the chamber around them. The bright blue-white beams of light cut through the darkness like stars. Suddenly, the lights hit something moving in the shadows. Two eyes reflected the light back at them with an eerie green glow. A jaguar was inside the chamber with them. Jaguars normally stay near cave entrances during the day, but during the extreme heat of dry season, they travel deep underground to find cool air. The humid limestone caves provide relief from the burning temperatures outside. The jaguar did not roar like a lion. Instead, it made a terrifying sound called sawing. The sawing sound was a rhythmic, deep grunting that sounded like a handsaw cutting through thick wood. Then the massive cat suddenly lunged forward at the cavers. Its powerful paws slammed onto the limestone floor with a loud thud. The jaguar hissed aggressively and then stopped just a few feet away. This was a false charge, a territorial warning that meant get out or the next attack is real. The cavers were trapped between the angry jaguar and the narrow crawl space behind them. They had to retreat, but turning around could be deadly. If they turned to crawl out forward, the jaguar would see their backs. In the animal kingdom, showing your back is an invitation to attack. Jaguars are ambush predators that strike at the back of the neck to kill prey. The team had to keep their headlamp lights fixed directly on the jaguar's eyes. Eye contact and bright light are dominant signals that tell predators to stay back. The cavers began backing up slowly while never breaking eye contact with the cat. They moved inch by inch toward the narrow passage. The jaguar watched them with its glowing eyes, ready to charge again if they showed weakness. Finally, the team reached the flat-out crawl and squeezed back through to safety. Arene Candide Cave, prehistoric bear mauling. Around 27,900 years ago, a teenage boy lived near Arene Candide Cave in Liguria, Italy. This was during the Ice Age when humans hunted with stone tools and lived in small groups. Scientists call this time period the Gravettian era. The boy was an adolescent who likely helped his family hunt and gather food. One day, he had a terrifying encounter with a massive bear. The bear attacked him with incredible violence near the cave. The animal bit and clawed at his body, causing severe injuries. The bear's teeth punctured through his fibula bone in his leg. Its claws left a linear marking across the left side of his skull. Parts of his jaw and shoulder were torn away during the brutal mauling. His skull suffered multiple fractures from the powerful attack. The bear may have damaged his neck bones in the cervical spine area. Scientists believe the attacker was either a brown bear or a cave bear. Cave bears were giant prehistoric bears that lived in European caves during the Ice Age. These massive animals could weigh over 1,000 pounds. Despite his terrible injuries, the teenage boy survived for a few days after the attack. His body tried to heal, but the damage was too severe. When he died, his family buried him with great care and respect. They placed valuable items in his grave, including beautiful decorative objects. In 1942, archaeologists discovered his skeleton inside Arene Candide cave. Because of the rich grave goods found with him, scientists nicknamed him Il Principe. Il Principe means the prince in Italian. His skeleton remained in storage for many decades. In 2025, scientists decided to study his bones again, using modern technology. They used special optic magnification tools to examine every mark on his skeleton. The microscopic analysis revealed new details about his injuries. The researchers confirmed that all his injuries happened around the time of his death. The pattern of bites, scratches, and broken bones matched a bear mauling. Sodwana Bay underwater cave moray eel attack. On May 21, 2015, underwater cameraman Bart Lukasik was diving off the coast of Sodwana Bay, South Africa. Lukasik worked for EarthTouch, a company that films wildlife documentaries. He was on a mission to capture footage of moray eels in their natural habitat. Sodwana Bay is famous for its beautiful coral reefs and diverse marine life. Lukasik spotted 2 large moray eels hiding under a rocky ledge. The ledge created a cave-like shelter where the eels lived. He slowly moved closer with his underwater camera to get better footage. Moray eels can grow up to 2 meters long in these waters. The species in this area is called the honeycomb moray eel. Lukasik focused his camera on the 2 giant eels beneath the overhang. The eels seemed calm at first as he filmed them. Without any warning, one of the large eels suddenly became aggressive. The moray eel charged straight at Lukasik with its mouth open. He was caught completely off guard by the sudden attack. The eel was defending its home and did not want him near the shelter. Lukasik found himself in a dangerous face-off with the angry creature. The moray eel's body moved like a snake through the water as it rushed toward him. Its sharp teeth and powerful jaws could cause serious injuries. Lukasik had no choice but to retreat immediately. He had to make a run for it through the water to escape. The eel drove him away from the ledge with aggressive movements. Lukasik realized he had made a critical mistake. He had crowded the moray eel's shelter by getting too close with his camera. Moray eels live in cracks, crevices, and rocky ledges throughout the ocean. After the terrifying encounter, Lukasik escaped without serious injury. The incident taught him that underwater caves and ledges belong to the animals that live there. Respecting their space is the only way to stay safe while filming dangerous sea creatures. Split Rock Reservoir Cave Bear Attack. On the 20th of December 2015, Christopher Petronino took 3 Boy Scouts hiking in Split Rock Reservoir, New Jersey. He was 50 years old and an experienced scout leader. He wanted to show them a small talus cave he had visited many times before. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had been to the same cave without problems. The cave opening was barely 2 feet wide between massive boulders. Petronino approached and began squeezing through feet first. His waist caught on a protruding edge as he descended. What he didn't know was that a 300-pound black bear was hiding in the darkness. The bear had claimed the cave as winter shelter. Suddenly, something grabbed Petronino's foot with powerful force. He was yanked deeper into the cave by the bear. The bear began attacking, biting his legs and raking claws across his shoulders and head. In absolute darkness, Petronino couldn't see his attacker. Outside, the 3 scouts saw their leader pulled violently into the darkness. They heard terrible sounds and immediately called 911. Inside, Petronino found his rock hammer and swung it at the bear's head. 2 strikes connected, creating a brief pause in the assault. He pulled his sweatshirt over his head and curled into a fetal position against the wall. The scouts placed food near the entrance to lure the bear out and built a signal fire. After 80 minutes trapped in darkness, the bear finally left the cave. Petronino crawled toward the light with torn and bleeding wounds covering his body. A helicopter airlifted him to the hospital. He had extensive bite marks and lacerations on his head, shoulders, arms, and legs. His injuries were serious but survivable. Nutty Putty Cave. Rescue Team Survival. On November 24, 2009, John Edward Jones became trapped in Nutty Putty Cave in Utah. He had crawled into an extremely tight passage upside down. The passage was so narrow that John's body became wedged and he could not move. He was stuck head down at a 70-degree angle deep inside the cave. When his family realized he was trapped, they immediately called for rescue. Teams of experienced cave rescuers rushed to Nutty Putty Cave. A rescuer named Ryan Schertz was one of the first to reach John's location. Schertz had to crawl through impossibly tight passages to get to the trapped man. The rescue team realized they were facing one of the most difficult extractions ever attempted. John was wedged in a passage only 10 inches wide and 18 inches tall. The tight space made it almost impossible for rescuers to work. Only one rescuer could squeeze into the area at a time. The team developed a plan to use a pulley system to pull John out. They bolted a heavy iron pulley into the cave wall above the passage. Steel cables were attached to John's legs to slowly pull him upward. The rescuers began carefully applying tension to lift John from the crevice. For a moment, the system seemed to be working. John's body moved slightly upward as the cable pulled. Then disaster struck during the rescue attempt. The massive iron pulley system suddenly snapped under the extreme tension. The bolts ripped out of the cave wall with tremendous force. The steel cable whipped backward like a deadly metal snake. Ryan Schertz was standing directly in the line of fire. The cable slammed into Schertz's face with incredible impact. The force nearly threw him into the same crevice where John was trapped. If Schertz had fallen into the tight passage, 2 men would have been stuck. But somehow Schertz managed to catch himself and avoid falling in. He was injured from the cable strike, but alive. The equipment failure meant John was now deeper in the crevice than before. The rescuers refused to give up and tried multiple other approaches. They worked for 27 hours straight in the claustrophobic passages. Rescuers took turns crawling into the tight space to help John. The cave passages were so narrow that rescuers could barely breathe. Multiple times during the rescue, small cave collapses threatened to trap the rescuers. Rock and debris fell around them as they worked in the unstable passages. Equipment continued to fail under the extreme conditions. Each failure put the rescuers' lives in danger. The psychological toll of working in such tight spaces was overwhelming. Rescuers experienced panic attacks from the extreme claustrophobia, but they kept trying every possible method to save John's life. After 27 hours of desperate attempts, the rescue had to be called off. John Edward Jones tragically died while still trapped in the passage. The rescuers barely escaped with their own lives. Ryan Schertz and the other team members survived multiple near-fatal incidents. The cable whip, equipment failures, and cave collapses could have killed them all. Their survival during the most claustrophobic rescue attempt in history was miraculous. Nutty Putty Cave was permanently sealed after this tragedy. The cave was considered too dangerous for any future exploration. The rescuers who survived that night carry the trauma of the failed rescue forever. Alaska Ice Cave 27-Day Survival. In 1944, a woman named Mossy Kilcher was exploring the wilderness of Alaska. Alaska was still a remote frontier with no modern GPS or satellite phones. If someone became lost in the wilderness, rescue could take weeks or never come at all. Mossy was exploring a series of ice caves formed within a massive glacier system. The ice caves were beautiful but extremely dangerous. As she moved through the frozen passages, disaster struck without warning. Mossy fell into a deep crevice hidden within the glacier. The crevice was a vertical crack in the ice that dropped far below the surface. She crashed down into the narrow ice chamber at the bottom. Mossy was injured from the fall, but alive. When she tried to climb out, she realized the walls were too slippery and steep. She was trapped deep inside the glacier with no way to escape. The temperature inside the ice cave was far below freezing. Mossy had no food with her and very limited supplies. The only water available was glacial meltwater dripping from the ice walls. She knew that rescue might never come to such a remote location. Search parties in 1944. Alaska had to cover massive areas on foot with primitive equipment. Most people who became lost in the Alaskan wilderness were never found. Mossy understood that her survival depended entirely on her own willpower. She made a decision to fight for her life no matter how long it took. To prevent herself from freezing to death, Mossy kept moving constantly. She paced back and forth in the narrow ice chamber to generate body heat. When she felt herself getting tired, she refused to sit down and rest. Sitting still in the sub-freezing temperature would cause hypothermia and death. Mossy also kept herself awake by singing songs at the top of her lungs. The sound of her own voice echoing off the ice walls helped her stay alert. Singing also gave her something to focus on besides the cold and hunger. Days turned into weeks as Mossy remained trapped in the frozen crevice. She drank only glacial meltwater to stay alive. Her body began to weaken severely from starvation and exposure, but her mind refused to give up hope. Every day she kept moving and singing to maintain her body temperature. The psychological battle was just as difficult as the physical one. Being alone in complete isolation for weeks tested her sanity. After 27 days trapped in the ice cave, a miracle happened. A search party that had nearly given up heard something in the distance. They followed the faint sound of singing echoing through the glacier. The searchers found Mossy alive in the deep crevice. She was severely malnourished and suffering from extreme exposure. But she had survived 27 days in sub-freezing temperatures with no food. The rescue team carefully pulled her out of the ice chamber. Mossy Kilcher was rushed to medical care and eventually recovered. Her survival became a legendary story in Alaska. The 27-day ordeal remains a famous case study in Mind Over Matter. Mossy's refusal to give up and her constant movement to fight hypothermia saved her life. Her story teaches that mental strength can overcome seemingly impossible physical conditions. Grotte de Gargas blind navigation survival. In the late 1800s, Edouard Alfred Martel entered Grotte de Gargas cave in France. Martel was a pioneering cave explorer who would later become known as the father of modern speleology. Speleology is the scientific study of caves and cave systems. On this expedition, Martel was exploring a completely unmapped section of the cave. No other human had ever been in these passages before. The cave system twisted deep underground for many miles. Martel carried only a magnesium torch to light his way through the darkness. Magnesium torches were primitive light sources that burned a special metal to create light. They were unreliable and could fail at any moment. Martel had traveled miles from the cave entrance when disaster struck. Without any warning, his magnesium torch suddenly failed and went out. He was plunged into absolute ink-black darkness. The darkness inside a cave is unlike anything on the surface. It is total and complete with not even the faintest hint of light. A person cannot see their own hand in front of their face. Martel was now lost miles underground with no light source. He had no way to see the passages, tunnels, or dangers around him. Most people would panic immediately in such a terrifying situation, but Martel understood that panic was the greatest danger he faced. If he panicked, he would make mistakes and become hopelessly lost forever. Martel forced himself to remain calm and think logically. He began using his other senses to navigate through the pitch-black cave. Martel felt the walls carefully with his hands to understand the shape of the passages. He ran his fingers along the rock to detect whether passages turned left or right. He smelled the air currents flowing through different tunnels. Fresh air currents meant a passage might lead toward the entrance. Stale air meant a passage was a dead end. Martel also listened carefully to the sound of water dripping and flowing. Underground streams always flow downward. Following the sound of water could guide him toward an exit. For hours, and some accounts say days, Martel crawled through the darkness. He moved slowly and carefully, feeling every inch of his path. The total distance he traveled in absolute darkness was 13.5 miles. Every step required concentration and trust in his senses. One wrong turn could trap him in the cave forever. Finally, after an exhausting journey, Martel saw a faint glow ahead. It was natural light coming from the cave entrance. He emerged alive from Grotte de Gargas against all odds. Sterkfontein Cave's 21-day air pocket survival. In 1984, cave diver Peter Verhulsel entered the Sterkfontein Caves in South Africa. The Sterkfontein Caves are a massive underground system filled with water passages. Peter was an experienced diver exploring the flooded sections of the cave. As he swam deeper into the cave system, something went terribly wrong. Peter became lost in the maze of underwater passages. He could not find his way back to the entrance. His air supply was running dangerously low. Peter swam desperately through the flooded tunnels searching for a way out. Then he saw something that gave him hope. Above the water, there was a small pocket of air trapped against the cave ceiling. Peter surfaced into the tiny air pocket and gasped for breath. The air pocket was a small, dry island inside the flooded cave. It was barely large enough for one person to sit on. Peter realized he was trapped with no way to escape the cave. The water surrounded him on all sides in total darkness. He had no food with him and only the diving gear he wore. Peter understood that rescue might never come to this remote location. Most people who became lost in flooded caves died within hours or days. The human body cannot survive long without food, especially in stressful conditions. But Peter Verhulsel refused to give up without a fight. He rationed the small amount of drinking water he could collect from condensation. The extreme humidity in the air pocket created water droplets on the cave walls. Peter stayed alive by licking moisture from the rocks. He sat in total, absolute darkness for days that turned into weeks. The isolation and darkness tested his sanity every single moment. His body began to shut down from starvation and stress. Peter knew he was dying but continued to hold on to life. He found paper and a writing tool in his diving gear. Peter began writing notes to his family telling them he loved them. The notes documented his thoughts and feelings as death approached. After 21 days trapped in the air pocket, Peter Verhulsel finally died. 3 weeks without food in such a stressful environment is far longer than doctors thought humanly possible. Medical experts were shocked that anyone could survive that long. Most people die within 10 to 14 days of total starvation. The extreme stress and isolation should have killed him even faster. But Peter's will to live and hope for rescue kept him alive for 21 miraculous days. Rescue teams eventually found Peter's body in the small air pocket. They also found the heartbreaking notes he had left for his family. The notes showed that Peter never gave up hope until his final moments. His 21-day survival is considered a biological miracle in the cave diving community. Punta Negra Incident. On Saturday, 5th January 1980, the ocean off the coast of Punta Negra, Chile looked calm. Jose Miranda, an experienced hookah diver, was aboard a small boat with his crew. Hookah diving used a long air hose connected to a compressor on the boat instead of heavy tanks. That morning, Jose had already completed one successful dive harvesting shellfish and spearfishing. The boat moved to a second dive location a short distance away. What the crew didn't fully appreciate was that this spot sat close to a sea lion haul-out. Earlier that week, divers had found fragments of sea lion bodies torn and scattered on the seabed. Jose slipped into the water, adjusted his gear, and swam about 15 feet from the boat. He was wearing a weight belt and began to descend. The air hose trailed behind him, and his exhaled breaths created bubbles that marked his position. Above, the sea lion haul-out remained active with sea lions diving and surfacing. From the surface, everything looked normal with bubbles rising steadily. Then, without warning, the bubbles stopped all at once. The compressor on the boat began to strain as pressure climbed rapidly. The water beside the boat erupted with a violent burst of red-stained bubbles. A massive great white shark surged upward with its jaws clamped around Jose. Jose had been decapitated with his head completely gone and one arm missing. A deep, straight bite mark ran horizontally across his body. The shark released Jose and slipped back beneath the surface. Other boats rushed toward the scene, but the shark began circling slowly and deliberately. It would rise above the surface, inspect the vessels, then ram them with its body. This happened at least 3 times as the shark guarded what it considered its prey. For hours, the boats were locked in a dangerous standoff. Eventually, through careful coordination, they managed to retrieve Jose's remains. Examination showed bite marks on his lower back, indicating the shark attacked from above. The weight belt around his stomach may have prevented the shark's lower jaws from cutting deeper. There was no additional feeding after the first bite. Everything happened in one moment. Witnesses estimated the shark at 25 feet, though experts suggest around 20 feet was more realistic. Jose Miranda had entered an area where a large apex predator was actively hunting near sea lions. Jose Miranda's death remains one of the most violent and rare shark attacks ever recorded in Chile. Fugro Brazil Incident. In mid-April 2016, Eduardo prepared for another shift on the diver support vessel Wyatt Candies off the Brazilian coast. His task was underwater inspection and maintenance work at 728 feet depth, where pressure reached 22 atmospheres. Eduardo worked for Fugro Brazil, specializing in subsea services. He had spent weeks living in pressurized chambers, his body saturated with inert gases at working depth pressure. He entered the diving bell, a pressurized 2-man chamber that served as transport. The bell descended through the water column and at 728 feet reached the seafloor. Eduardo wore specialized equipment with an umbilical supplying breathing gas, hot water, power, and communication. On his back, he carried a Divex SLS rebreather as emergency backup. Eduardo exited the bell and moved across the seafloor with powerful work lights. An ROV accompanied him, monitoring his safety from a distance. The work proceeded normally with Eduardo performing tasks he had done countless times. His lights were attracting attention from something watching in the darkness. A swordfish approximately 5 feet long swam in the depths surrounding the worksite. The fish approached, swimming closer to investigate the bright lights. The attack happened without warning as Eduardo's back was turned. The swordfish accelerated suddenly with its bill aimed like a spear at Eduardo's back. The bill jammed directly into the Divax SLS rebreather, mounted on his back, not penetrating his body. The swordfish found its bill stuck and began thrashing violently. Its tail whipped back and forth with explosive force transmitted through the rebreather. Eduardo felt the impacts but couldn't see what was happening behind him. His umbilical connection remained intact, and he was still breathing normally. Eduardo made the decision to return to the diving bell immediately. The ROV camera captured Eduardo moving across the seafloor with the 5-foot swordfish jammed into his equipment. Eduardo reached the bell and positioned himself for entry. As he positioned at the entrance, the swordfish made one final desperate attempt to free itself. Suddenly, the swordfish came loose and swam away rapidly into the darkness. Inside the pressurized chamber, Eduardo was completely unharmed. His body had never been touched and the umbilical remained fully intact, but the Divex SLS rebreather showed obvious damage from the attack. The SLS had saved Eduardo's life by intercepting an impact that would have been devastating. The ROV video was released and went viral, accumulating millions of views worldwide. Pozo de Gavilan Incident. On June 9, 2007, Helios Medina and 9 companions arrived at Pozo de Gavilan in Mexico. The site was a massive sinkhole approximately 300 feet deep and 200 feet in diameter. 5 members, including Medina, were certified cave divers planning to explore underwater passages. The remaining 5 were there to practice vertical rope techniques. Sunday morning, the team began rigging the pit for descent, using their vehicle as the primary anchor. At approximately 10 a.m., Medina began the first descent. About 100 feet into the 285-foot drop, his descent rate increased dramatically. He wrapped the rope around his leg to add friction and regain control, causing a rope burn. The remaining team descended without incident, and the 5 divers explored the underwater passages. Around 2 p.m., they exited the pool and prepared for the 285-foot climb out. Medina positioned himself as the last person out while others began climbing. By 3 p.m., 2 people had reached the surface and 4 were climbing on the 2 ropes. Suddenly, a scream came from above. One climber had accidentally disturbed a large nest of Africanized honeybees hidden in the limestone. Thousands of bees erupted, swarming the 4 climbers suspended on ropes. The 2 people at the surface rushed to the edge and were also attacked. One experienced member rigged a 3rd rope and rappelled down while being stung. He reached the first climber, attached a lanyard, cut her ascender slings, and climbed out dragging her weight. He immediately descended again to rescue the 2nd climber. After reaching the surface with the 2nd rescue, his body began to rebel from exhaustion and bee stings. 2 climbers remained stranded on the ropes at 80 feet and 120 feet above the floor. Medina put on his wetsuit for protection and began climbing toward the lower stranded person. Bees landed on his exposed face, neck, and hands as he climbed. He reached the stranded climber at 80 feet, attached a tether, and rappelled back to the floor. One victim remained suspended 120 feet above, still being attacked. Suddenly, the rope jerked violently. Someone had started the SUV anchor, trying to haul the ropes up. Medina assessed the rope system was no longer safe to climb. The male climber he rescued began deteriorating with signs of shock and stopped breathing properly. The team began artificial respiration as emergency sirens echoed from above. By 4:15 p.m., approximately 50 rescue workers had assembled at the top. The bee swarm remained active, attacking anyone within 300 feet of the pit edge. The female still stranded on rope had stopped moving entirely after receiving over 1,000 stings. Rescuers hauled the ropes up, bringing her body to the surface and to a waiting ambulance. The critically injured male was also hauled out and transported to the hospital. Medina reached the surface at approximately 1 a.m., 15 hours after first rappelling in. The first rescued woman received over 600 stings and was hospitalized for 3 days. The second rescued woman received over 900 stings and spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The male received approximately 400 stings and was hospitalized for 3 days. The woman stranded highest received over 1,200 stings, spent a week in intensive care, developed a blood clot, and required several more weeks of hospitalization. All 5 victims ultimately survived the horrifying nightmare at Pozo de Gavilan swimming hole pit incident. On June 3, 2014, Ken Harrington, 70, and Dave Belsky, 77, drove into Eddy County, New Mexico. Over the years, they had documented more than 500 cave and karst features in the county. Today's objective was Swimming Hole Pit, one of many sinkholes that dotted the landscape. These sinkholes formed when water rose from underground sources, dissolving gypsum deposits and creating voids that collapsed. Harrington and Belsky arrived and began their examination. Harrington worked his way down toward the water at the bottom. Belsky explored the opposite side, examining the walls and structure. He noticed deep crevices where the edge was actively calving off. Belsky called out to Harrington, asking him to come see the crevices. Belsky decided to get a closer look and began sliding down into one of the crevices. As his weight disturbed the crack, something hidden in the darkness stirred. An Africanized bee nest, concealed in the crevice, erupted in response. Thousands of bees poured out and swarmed immediately. The swarm located Harrington first since he was closer to the crevice. The first stings hit his exposed skin on his face, neck, and hands. They weren't coming one at a time, but in dozens. Harrington ran toward their truck, the only enclosed enclosed space available. The bees then turned their attention to Lipski at the crevice. One stung him directly on the lip. One bee flew directly into his mouth, and he instinctively swallowed it. Several more bees attempted to crawl into his ear canal. Both men reached the truck and threw themselves inside, slamming the doors. Dozens of bees had followed them into the vehicle, still attacking. The swarm outside pressed against the windows, crawling across the glass. Harrington and Lipski began killing the bees that had made it inside. Eventually, the bees inside were eliminated and the swarm outside began to disperse. Lipski had received multiple stings, including one on the lip, arms, and head. Harrington had his own collection of stings, each site swelling and throbbing. Luckily, neither showed signs of allergic response. After waiting to ensure no delayed symptoms would develop, they were able to drive away. At 70 and 77 years old respectively, they were the demographic most vulnerable to serious complications. The fact they escaped with only a few stings rather than hundreds likely prevented a much more serious outcome. Shelter Cave Incident. In September 1985, 5 young people decided to camp in a shelter cave near the Platte River in Nebraska. Michael Wiles was 12 years old. His older brother Mark was 18. Their friend David Funkhauser was 17. 2 other youths were also in the group. Shelter caves are natural rock overhangs that provide protection from weather. They arrived in the late afternoon with camping gear. As evening approached and temperature dropped, they built a campfire near the cave mouth. Eventually, all 5 settled into sleeping bags beneath the rock overhang. The campfire provided warmth, and they felt safe. But they had created a deadly combination without knowing it. Groundwater had been seeping through the rock layers, gradually weakening the structure. The campfire heat made it worse. When rock heats, it expands. When it cools, it contracts. This created stress along existing cracks. Together, groundwater and fire heat were compromising the ceiling above them. But there was no visible warning. Without any warning, a massive slab of cave ceiling suddenly collapsed. Tons of rock came crashing down on the sleeping campers. The collapse happened with devastating speed. Michael Wiles was crushed instantly beneath the falling debris. His brother Mark died in the same instant. David Funkhauser also died beneath the falling rock. The 2 other youths somehow escaped being crushed. They survived but were in complete shock. They tried desperately to dig through the rubble, but the weight was too heavy for 2 teenagers to move. The survivors made their way out to seek help. When rescue workers arrived, they found a devastating scene. Recovery required heavy equipment to lift the collapsed slab. The investigation identified groundwater seepage and campfire heat as the causes. The combination had weakened the rock and triggered the collapse. Marbo Cave Incident. On the 25th of July 2015, Senior Airman Drew Belair prepared for a weekend adventure. He was 20 years old from Iowa, deployed to Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. The temperature was 89 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air felt thick and oppressive. Drew's friends had told him about Marbo Cave's legendary freshwater pools. They described it as a swimming paradise. The entrance lay hidden beneath ancient trees with a steep descent. At the bottom, the cave system revealed crystal clear water. The main pool was about 100 feet across. Beneath the surface, darker openings led to underwater passages. After the brutal heat above, the cool water felt like paradise. Drew's friends were swimming through underwater passages between different sections. Drew had always been a strong swimmer. He spotted an entrance to a cave about 8 feet below the surface. His friends had mentioned chambers with air pockets where you could rest. Drew took several deep breaths and dove down. The underwater world was beautiful with blue-green light. He entered the opening and the limestone walls closed around him. But something was wrong. The passage continued much longer than expected. It curved and branched in unexpected ways. Drew's chest tightened as his air supply ran low. There was no sign of an air pocket ahead. Panic set in. He had entered a different section than his friends described. Drew tried to turn around, but the tunnel was barely wider than his shoulders. His movements became frantic. The return felt like swimming through molasses. His vision narrowed with dark spots. On the surface, his friends noticed his absence and grew alarmed. They dove repeatedly searching for him. But Marbo's cave system was vast with dozens of passages. Without proper diving equipment, their search was limited. Deep in the maze, Drew's strength failed. His brain struggled to maintain direction. His body began to shut down from a lack of oxygen. One friend scrambled up to call emergency services, but help was many minutes away in the remote jungle location. By the time rescue divers arrived with scuba equipment, it was too late. They found Drew about 40 feet from the main entrance. He was trapped in a section with no air pocket and no escape. Mount Hood Pit Incident. On Friday, November 25th, 1982, Larry Ritchie started a 3-day winter hike on Mount Hood in Oregon. Larry was 34 years old and prepared for the cold weather. He wore long underwear, wool pants, a parka, mittens, and rubber-soled boots. He packed food and shelter for the trip. Larry left an itinerary with friends telling them he would return by Tuesday. On Sunday, the weather changed and snow started falling. Larry moved slowly on snowshoes across the snowy terrain. Suddenly, he took a step and the ground disappeared beneath him. Larry fell into a hidden snow-covered pit. He dropped 12 to 14 feet and landed hard on his back. His backpack absorbed the impact and saved him from serious injury. Larry was alive but trapped at the bottom of a pit. The pit was about 10 feet wide with walls that curved inward. A stream of cold water swirled along the floor. Larry lit a candle to see in the darkness. He explored a passage for 200 feet looking for an exit, but he found no way out and the air was stale. Larry's stove had been smashed in the fall. He had to eat all his food cold. Larry had a 30-foot rope in his pack. He tied a rock to the rope and tried to throw it up through the hole. He wanted to snag it on something and climb out. For 3 days, he threw the rope, but it kept falling back down. The first 2 nights, Larry slept standing up to stay out of the water. On the 3rd night, he hung himself in a rope loop to keep his feet dry. By Thursday, Larry had run out of food. Hypothermia was setting in and his speech began to slur. Finally, the rock snagged on a dead tree limb outside the hole. Larry climbed the rope and pulled himself out of the pit. He was out but soaked, exhausted, and hypothermic. It was raining, but Larry kept walking. He walked 10 miles through the cold until he reached Highway 35. Larry got a ride to safety. His preparation and persistence saved his life. P-29, Wreck Diving Incident. On October 12, 2024, Daryl Nicholas Pascoe and his wife Sue arrived in Malta for a diving holiday. Daryl was 66 years old and an experienced dive master. He had logged countless dives over his career. Malta is famous for its shipwreck dive sites. The P-29 wreck was one of Malta's most popular diving spots. The patrol boat had been deliberately sunk to create an artificial reef. It lay at a manageable depth for divers. Daryl prepared for the dive with his assigned dive buddy. They checked their equipment and entered the water. The conditions were good with clear visibility and calm seas. They descended toward the P-29 wreck. As they went deeper, they had to equalize the pressure in their ears. Daryl and his buddy reached the wreck and began exploring. Just 3 minutes into the dive, something went wrong. Daryl signaled to his buddy that he wanted to go up. His signal showed urgency and panic. Then Daryl did something dangerous. He shot straight to the surface without stopping. The air in his lungs expanded rapidly as he ascended. This caused severe damage to his lung tissue. When Daryl reached the surface, he was in severe distress. His dive buddy grabbed him to keep him afloat. Then Daryl went into cardiac arrest. His heart stopped beating in the water. Rescuers struggled to keep him afloat while doing CPR. They hauled him to shore and continued CPR on solid ground. Paramedics arrived and took over. Daryl was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. Daryl Nicholas Pascoe was pronounced dead. Diccan Pot Incident. On December 27, 2007, Stuart Goodwill and Caroline Fletcher went caving in North Yorkshire, England. Stuart was 33 years old and an experienced caver. Caroline was 28, and this was her first time going underground. She had asked Stuart many times to take her caving. Stuart chose Diccan Pot, a popular cave system often used for beginners. They entered the cave with proper equipment on Thursday morning. One route in the cave leads through Long Lower Churn. Long Lower Churn is a passage where a stream flows through constantly. Usually the stream is small and easy to cross, but heavy rain had been falling on the hills above the cave. The rain-soaked ground sent water rushing underground. Stuart and Caroline were in Long Lower Churn when the water began to rise. Flash floods in caves happen very fast. Water that was ankle-deep became waist-deep in minutes. The gentle stream became a dangerous torrent. At some point, one of them lost their footing in the current. The cold water temperature was around 40 to 45 degrees. Caroline was getting very cold. Stuart decided they should try to exit the cave together. They moved through the flooded passages trying to reach safety, but the water kept rising and the current grew stronger. Then disaster struck. They became tangled in their safety ropes. They couldn't free themselves as the water rose above their heads. Stuart's wife, Claire, raised the alarm when he didn't come home. She called North Yorkshire Police at 10 p.m. 20 cave rescuers entered Diccan Pot to search. They found Stuart and Caroline in Long Lower Churn. Both had drowned, held in place by the entangled ropes. The rescue team worked through the night to recover their bodies. By dawn on December 28th, both were brought to the surface. Orange Grove Sink Incident. On February 7, 1988, 3 divers arrived at Orange Grove Sink in Suwannee County, Florida. John Gilligan was 18 years old and excited about the dive. He had completed 20 dives over 18 months. But John had no cave diving certification. He carried only 1 air tank with no backup. He had only 1 light instead of the required 3. The 3 divers entered the cave and descended into the lower cavern. They made a deadly mistake. They used no guideline to mark their route. In cave diving, a guideline is not optional. John led the group deeper into the cave system. They passed through 2 tight constrictions. They reached a small chamber beyond the second constriction. John decided there was nothing interesting to see. He wrote on his slate, "Nothing here. Let's leave." But exiting would be much harder than entering. Their movements had stirred up silt in the water. The visibility was now completely gone. One companion carefully backed out through the silted passages. John made a different choice. Instead of backing out, he decided to go straight up. He saw a tight vertical hole above him. John entered the narrow vertical passage. While he was still inside the tight hole, his air ran out. He was 120 feet below the surface with no air. John tried to keep ascending but became stuck. He could not hold his breath any longer. He inhaled water and drowned in the constriction. His companions surfaced without him and called for help. A recovery team entered the cave to find John's body. They turned off their lights in the darkness. They saw a glow coming from above. John's light was still burning in the vertical hole. The recovery divers found his body stuck at 120 feet. They brought John Gilligan to the surface later that day. Diccan Pot Incident. On the 19th of January 2025, experienced cave explorers met in North Yorkshire. They planned to explore Diccan Pot, a well-known cave system near Settle. The cave's first pitch was a vertical drop of 100 feet. The cave's design included a traverse that blocked the view from above. Once a caver started descending, they disappeared from sight. It was a cold winter day. The group performed safety checks before going down. They checked equipment, ropes, and harnesses carefully. At 12:27 p.m., the group took positions around the first pitch. The caver going down did final equipment checks. The rope stretched tight over the edge into darkness. Team members above watched the rope for signs of progress. Minutes passed as the caver descended. Without warning, a loud bang suddenly broke the quiet. Team members immediately knew something was wrong. They tried to communicate but were met with silence. They tested the rope system. The rope had become taut, suggesting their teammate might be suspended and injured. They couldn't see what had happened. The group called the Cave Rescue Organization for help. The rescue team arrived with specialized equipment. They set up rope systems at the cave entrance. The rescue team leader rappelled down the 100-foot pitch. When he reached the bottom, his worst fears were confirmed. The caver lay motionless on the rocky floor. The rescuer checked for pulse and breathing, but found none. More team members rappelled down. They carefully placed the explorer onto a rescue stretcher. Lifting the stretcher 100 feet straight up took hours of careful work. Finally, they brought the caver to the surface. Paramedics were waiting but could only confirm he was gone. Mystic Cave Incident. On 7th October 2022, 3 cave explorers prepared at the entrance of Mystic Cave in South Dakota's Black Hills. Mark Jennings, a veteran caver standing 6 feet 2 inches, checked his equipment with 2 experienced companions. Their mission was to explore and map a newly discovered lead at the deepest section. They entered Mystic Cave at 9:15 a.m. 40 minutes in, they reached what had been considered the end of the explorable cave. In the farthest corner, a small opening marked recent excavation work. Mark volunteered to investigate first. He removed his helmet and began pushing through the 9 or 10 inch high passage. 6 feet in, Mark encountered a sharp 90-degree bend to the right. He extended his right arm around the corner while twisting his torso. Beyond the first bend, the passage took another sharp turn left, creating an S shape. Mark removed his boots and pushed them ahead to make the turn. Beyond the S bend, the passage angled upward into a small chamber just large enough to sit in. Mark took a moment to catch his breath before preparing to exit. Descending head first, he reached the first bend and immediately sensed something was wrong. His body would not fold around the corners in reverse. 15 minutes into his exit attempt, Mark could not work his lower body through the second bend. His companions could barely reach his outstretched hands. After an hour of fruitless efforts, Mark was thoroughly stuck. He was flat on his stomach with arms extended forward and legs stretched behind. 2 hours into the entrapment, one companion left to call for rescue. 4 hours in, local caving experts arrived with communications wire, food, water, heat packs, and tools. They used a hammer drill to modify the passage, removing rock fractions of an inch at a time. 10 hour brought a crisis when uncontrollable shivering triggered from cold and hypothermia. The drilling continued in shifts throughout the night. By hour 15, enough material had been removed that Mark could pull his knees up slightly. At 5:45 a.m. on 8th October, after 18 hours of complete immobility, the final extraction succeeded. Rescuers pulled on webbing secured around Mark's wrists, and his body finally slid forward. In the chamber beyond, rescuers wrapped him in emergency blankets and provided warm fluids. When Mark emerged into early morning sunlight, the experience had permanently altered his relationship with confined spaces. Pepper Sauce Cave Incident. On the 25th of June 2004, Dan Garrison, 38, and his 11-year-old son Justin prepared for a cave exploration. Their destination was Pepper Sauce Cave in Arizona. The outside temperature was 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Dan had promised this adventure to Justin for his recent birthday. Dan packed minimal supplies with 2 flashlights, snacks, and water bottles. He made 2 critical mistakes. no spare batteries, and he told no one where they were going. They arrived at Pepper Sauce Cave around noon. The temperature inside dropped immediately to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into chambers, other times narrowing to crawls. After about 2 hours, they reached the book room and signed the visitor log. They had descended to a lower level using a rope fixed by previous explorers. Dan decided it was time to head back, but the passages all looked the same. After an hour of wrong turns and backtracking, Dan's watch showed 4 p.m. They were lost and no one knew where to find them. Every passage led to another that looked just like it. Dan's flashlight beam was already growing dimmer without spare batteries. As 7 p.m. approached, Dan made a critical decision to create a mapping system. Using a compass on his watch, they sketched passages and marked dead ends. By 10 p.m., their flashlights were noticeably dimmer, and their snacks were gone. Justin curled up on hard ground to rest while Dan continued mapping. Throughout the night, sleep came in brief, uncomfortable stretches. Dan's watch showed 7 a.m. They had been in the cave for 19 hours. Their flashlights would not last much longer, and thirst had become constant. Justin suggested they listen for dripping sounds to find water. They followed the sound through narrow passages they hadn't explored before. Justin's flashlight beam caught a rope hanging down from above. It was the same rope they had used to descend to the lower level. They climbed the rope to the upper level, and Dan recognized familiar formations. Following his memory and their crude map, they made steady progress. After nearly 24 hours, they saw faint natural light ahead. Snapper Point Sea Cave Incident. On the 25th of December 2018, 2 men stood near the sea caves at Snapper Point in New South Wales, Australia. It was Christmas Day, and the ocean looked calm. The men had no ropes, no helmets, and no tide tables. From the outside, the caves didn't look dangerous. The openings were wide, and the waves rolled in lazily. They stepped inside when the tide was low enough that the floor was exposed. The rock beneath their feet was slick with algae. They moved deeper into the cave, exploring the passages. The cave felt ancient, solid, and permanent. As they explored, the tide outside continued its slow, invisible climb. At first, they noticed nothing more than dampening air and occasional splashes. By the time they turned back, the cave had changed. The entrance was no longer a doorway, but a moving wall of water. Waves surged into the cave, filling it chest high before retreating. The exit existed only in fractions of seconds, disappearing behind white water. Every surge pushed farther in, stealing more space. The men were trapped by timing, not by collapse or darkness. A man outside realized they hadn't returned and immediately called for help. Emergency services were alerted and surf lifesavers arrived at the headland. Rescuers positioned themselves carefully, reading the water and watching how each wave entered. They waited for the brief moment when the ocean retreated to expose the rock. When the water pulled back, rescuers moved fast into the cave. They braced themselves against the walls as the next wave exploded inward. Inside, the trapped men stayed low, clinging to stone. The rescuers positioned themselves between the men and the walls, taking the impact first. The extraction happened in pieces between surges. Between waves, a rescuer would grab an arm, move a step or two, then stop and brace. At the cave mouth, timing mattered most. When the water pulled back, rescuers dragged the men sideways onto the rock platform. They cleared the opening moments before the cave filled again. The men collapsed, shaking, exhausted but alive. Troxel Cave Incident. In 2009, Stephen Troxel, 21, stood with his friends Brandon, 26, and Brooke, 21, at Sloan's Valley Cave System in Kentucky. It was 9 days before Christmas during winter break. Stephen told his mother he would be back before dinner. None of them had formal caving experience or training, but Stephen and Brandon had been in this cave once before. They entered through the greenhouse entrance around midday. They wore tennis shoes, not sturdy boots. Stephen carried a lantern in one hand. They had no helmets, no hands-free lights, no gloves, and no proper gear. The 3 friends moved deeper into the system, following the same route from their previous visit. They penetrated 3/4 of a mile into the cave, approximately 4,000 feet from the entrance. Then they encountered a pit, a vertical drop approximately 30 feet deep. Stephen decided to free climb down the pit with no ropes, harness, or safety equipment. It was approximately 2 p.m. He began his descent with the lantern occupying one hand. The tennis shoes provided minimal friction against the rock. During the descent, something went wrong. A handhold crumbled or a foothold slipped. Suddenly, he was falling. Stephen's body slammed into the wall violently as he continued to free fall. He landed headfirst in a small puddle of water, only inches deep. His head struck the rock floor beneath it with devastating force. The impact caused blunt force trauma, and he died instantly. Brandon and Brooke were trapped at the top of the pit, unable to reach him. They navigated 3/4 of a mile back through the cave. They emerged from the greenhouse entrance around 3 p.m., approximately 1 hour after Stephen's fall. They called 911 immediately. Emergency responders were dispatched to the cave system. The 2 survivors initially refused to go back into the cave. Rescue teams had to search through the passages for hours. Outside, the Troxel family gathered in the cold December night, waiting. The rescue crews finally located Stephen at the bottom of the pit where he had fallen. At approximately 10:30 p.m., p.m., over 8 hours after the fall, rescuers emerged carrying his body. The Troxel family was there waiting as their worst fears were confirmed. Stephen's mother later expressed surprise, saying he was always timid and afraid of his own shadow. 9 days before Christmas, the Troxel family was planning a funeral instead of celebrating the holidays. Rattling Cave Incident. On the 24th of February 2001, 2 experienced cave explorers arrived at Rattling Cave in Tennessee. Ray Pritchett was 34 years old, and her companion was Michael Green. Rattling Cave had a vertical drop of 133 feet straight down. They began rigging ropes to anchor points at the top. Green volunteered to descend first. He attached his rappel device and began his descent. Green reached the bottom safely and waited. At the top, Pritchett prepared for her rappel. She used a rappel rack attached to her harness with a single auto-locking carabiner. The carabiner had a plastic locking sleeve to prevent the gate from opening. Pritchett checked her setup and began her descent. But something was wrong. The carabiner and rack may have been oriented incorrectly. As Pritchett descended, forces on her equipment shifted. Without warning, the plastic locking sleeve broke. The gate sprang open. Pritchett's rappel device detached completely from her harness. She suddenly found herself in free fall. She plummeted potentially 100 feet or more. Pritchett's body slammed into Green face first with tremendous force. Both crashed to the rocky floor. The impact was devastating. Pritchett sustained multiple fractures and head trauma. Green injured his arm. Both lay at the bottom of the 133-foot pit in shock. Green was in better condition than Pritchett. He understood their only hope was for him to climb out and get help. Despite his injured arm, Green prepared to ascend. He pulled himself up the rope foot by foot. The 133-foot climb took significant time and effort. When Green reached the top, he immediately contacted emergency services. Specialized cave rescue teams arrived. They descended with a rescue litter. Rescuers found Pritchett conscious but in extreme pain. They stabilized her and placed her in the rescue litter. The team hauled her up 133 feet using pulleys and ropes. After a long ordeal, Pritchett emerged from the pit. She was transported to the hospital immediately. Remarkably, she survived a fall that could have easily killed her. Guna Caves Incident. On 3rd September 2006, 9 friends from Kerala arrived at the Guna Caves in Kodaikanal. Locals called them the Devil's Kitchen and refused to visit after dark. By 2006, 13 people had fallen into the caves and never come out. Hidden holes dropped over 100 feet straight down into darkness. The 9 friends called themselves the Manjirul Boys. Saju David was 26 and the leader. Subhash Chandran was 19 and the youngest. They saw a broken fence and a warning sign in Tamil they couldn't read, so they went in. While exploring, they suddenly realized Subhash had vanished. Where he had been standing was a hole about 3 feet across. They shined phone lights into it but saw only blackness. Police arrived hours later with fire department officials. Then they heard a faint cry from deep below. Subhash was alive. He had fallen but his belt caught on a rock edge, stopping his fall. Officials estimated he'd fallen at least 120 feet down. The officer told David that rescue attempts always failed here. Firemen tried from the surface, but Subhash had lost consciousness. David decided he would go in himself. Police protested, but David was determined. At 4 p.m., David tied a rope around his waist and descended. The hole was barely wide enough with slick moss-covered walls. At 60 feet down, hundreds of disturbed bats forced him to turn off his flashlight. The first rope ran out, so friends tied another. At 120 feet down, David's flashlight found Subhash on a narrow ledge. His body was twisted and bloody but breathing. David tied the rope around Subhash's torso. The ascent took another hour with rope scraping against rocks. At one point, they got stuck, but David freed it. When they emerged 6 hours after the fall, a cheer went up. Subhash was rushed to the hospital unconscious but alive. David collapsed with shredded hands. Subhash became the first person in history to fall into Guna Caves and survive. In 2008, Saju David received India's Civilian Award for Bravery. Keld Head Cave Diving Incident. On a day in 1980, 4 divers entered Keld Head Cave in North Yorkshire, England. They were doing a training dive in the underwater cave system. One of the divers was Mark Woodhouse. Mark was still learning about cave diving. The plan was simple: follow the guideline into the cave and return safely. The group moved deeper into the cold, dark water. They were about 100 meters from the entrance. Suddenly, Mark became tangled in the guideline. The rope wrapped around his diving equipment. Mark freed himself from the line, but the struggle made him panic. His breathing became fast and uncontrolled. His heart raced with fear. Mark swam forward and surfaced in an air bell. An air bell is a pocket of air trapped inside the cave. Mark was still panicking even though he could breathe. A second diver nearby saw that Mark was in trouble. The diver needed a moment to adjust his position in the water. Before he could help, Mark dove back down into the water. The second diver thought Mark was swimming back to the exit. This seemed normal for a stressed diver. A few minutes passed. The second diver became worried. He couldn't see Mark anywhere. The diver followed the guideline toward the entrance. About 50 meters from the airbell, he found Mark. Mark was lying on his back on the cave floor. His mouthpiece was out of his mouth. Mark had drowned. The second diver tried to pull Mark toward the exit. He moved him 50 meters closer to the entrance, but it was too late to save him. The diver had to leave Mark and exit safely. Later that day, Mark's body was recovered from the cave. Perry County sinkhole fall. On August 15, 2013, 28-year-old Mary Crowell was inspecting food plots in Perry County, Missouri. She worked as an agricultural inspector for the government. Mary needed to check crops planted by landowner Michael Kleefeld. Kleefeld offered to drive her to the plots on his ATV. The fields were large and walking would take too long. Mary climbed on the ATV behind a Kleefeld. They rode across the field on a hot August day. The grass was very tall and reached above the ATV's tires. The tall grass hid what was underneath. Perry County sits on limestone rock. Over thousands of years, water dissolved the limestone underground. This created hidden caves and sinkholes beneath the soil. Kleefeld drove toward one of his food plots. Everything seemed normal. Suddenly, the front wheels dropped into nothing. The ground disappeared beneath them. The ATV pitched forward and tumbled into a hidden sinkhole. The 600-pound vehicle flipped through the air. Mary was thrown from her seat. She hit the ground hard inside the sinkhole. Then the ATV came crashing down on top of her. The weight crushed her chest and she couldn't breathe. The ATV pinned her against the rocks at the bottom. Kleefeld was thrown clear and landed on the slope. He got up and saw Mary trapped under the ATV. He tried to lift the vehicle, but it was too heavy. Kleefeld immediately called 911. The Perry County Sheriff and Beale Fire Department rushed to the scene. They found Mary trapped under the ATV in the sinkhole. Sinkhole rescues are extremely dangerous because the ground is unstable. The rescuers climbed down into the sinkhole anyway. They carefully lifted the ATV off Mary. They used ropes and a backboard to pull her out. Mary was taken to Perry County Memorial Hospital. She had broken bones and internal bruising from being crushed. Mary was lucky the sinkhole wasn't deeper and that rescuers arrived quickly. Locomotive Breath Cave Incident. On June 1st, 2019, two men drove to Locomotive Breath Cave in Virginia. They were not experienced cavers. They had no training and no cave map. They wanted to explore the hard parts of the cave. Locomotive Breath Cave is a wild cave with no lights or handrails. It has tight passages and many tunnels that branch in different directions. The two men entered the cave on Saturday afternoon. They had flashlights and confidence. The cave passages split into more passages. Soon they were in a maze where every tunnel looked the same. About an hour in, their first flashlight died, but they still had other lights, so they kept going deeper. The passages twisted and turned. Then they realized they were lost. Their other flashlights started dying one by one. The men made a terrible decision. They decided to split up. Now they were two isolated people alone in the dark. The hours passed and Saturday became Sunday. Their flashlights died completely. They sat in total darkness with no way to find each other. Sunday became Monday. One man didn't show up for work. His family started calling with no answer. Investigators used the rental truck's OnStar system to find the vehicle. It was parked at a diner near the cave. Rescue teams searched Locomotive Breath Cave but found nothing. Monday became Tuesday, then Tuesday became Wednesday. The men sat in darkness for 4 days. Cave temperature was in the 50s, causing severe hypothermia. Finally, experienced cavers went back and found both men. They were barely alive and had stopped shivering. The rescuers gave them food, water, and warming blankets. They had to wait for the men to warm up before moving them. Eventually, both men started shivering again, which was a good sign. One man made it to within 100 feet of the entrance and collapsed. Rescuers had to carry him out in a stretcher. After 4 days underground, both men were brought back into sunlight. They made a full recovery. Lambert's Cave Fall. On August 17, 2014, 18-year-old Travis Bungham went to find Lambert's Cave in Minnesota with his friends. The group planned to explore the abandoned cave system. The cave entrance was hidden by vegetation and hard to find. During the search, Travis's friends left without him. They took all the proper gear and supplies with them. Travis was left alone with only his cell phone and 2 lighters. As darkness fell, Travis kept searching for the cave entrance. He used his phone for light as he moved through the area. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath his feet. Travis fell 20 feet down into the cave's entrance shaft. He hit the bottom hard and fractured his arm. Cuts and bruises covered his body from the fall. Travis pulled out his cell phone and was surprised to find a signal. Lambert's Cave was actually a former silica mine, which allowed phone signals to reach inside. He quickly called his girlfriend and told her he was trapped and hurt. Then his phone battery died. Travis was now alone in complete darkness at the bottom of the shaft. The cave temperature was very cold, around 40 to 50 degrees. He was not dressed for these freezing conditions. Travis decided to build a fire using his 2 lighters to stay warm. He burned old wood and debris he found in the cave. The fire kept him warm but created a deadly problem. Smoke began filling the enclosed cave with no way to escape. The fire also produced carbon monoxide, poisonous gas. Travis kept burning everything he could find. He drifted in and out of consciousness from carbon monoxide poisoning. His girlfriend immediately called emergency services after their call ended, but she didn't know the exact location of Lambert's Cave. Rescuers tried to contact local cave experts for help. Almost Almost all the experts were at a gathering in a valley with no cell phone service. After hours of searching, St. Paul firefighters finally located the cave. They rigged ropes and carefully pulled Travis up through the 20-foot shaft. Travis was rushed to the hospital for treatment of his fractured arm, cuts, and smoke poisoning. Indian Creek Caverns Incident. On the 27th of March, 1977, 4 young men entered Indian Creek Caverns in Missouri. Doug Beckerderfer and Gary Blades were 20, Ed Brown was 20, and Wayne Smith was 18. They left a note on their truck with a phone number before entering. The cave was a wild system that locals called Old Mud Cave. What they didn't know was that torrential rain had started falling above them. Indian Creek Caverns floods when it rains heavily. The 4 young men were inexperienced and didn't know the danger. By Sunday evening, they should have been heading back, but they failed to return. Ed Brown's father called authorities. The cave was flooding badly. 7 inches of rain had fallen, draining underground into the caverns. By Monday afternoon, experienced cave rescuers were called in. At 8 a.m. Tuesday morning, rescuers went in. Water level was 5 feet above normal. Rescuers waded through chest-deep water with only inches of airspace. At 9 a.m., just 390 feet from the entrance, they found them. The 4 young men were lying in 2.5 feet of water. They were arranged in a strange, ordered line. Each man had his hands clutched on the person in front at chest level. A human chain, locked together even in death. The lead man held glasses in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Around his neck, the electric headlamp was still glowing after 36 hours. Rescuers pieced together what happened. The 4 had entered Sunday morning when everything was fine. While they explored, the water rose and blocked the entrance. They retreated to dry upper levels to wait. Hours passed and hypothermia set in from the cold and wet conditions. Monday morning, they decided to try escaping as a human chain. The lead man put in a fresh battery. Each person held the one in front so no one got separated. They reached the entrance, but water was still too deep. They turned back, but the lead man collapsed from hypothermia. When he fell, the others fell too. They went down in the water, still holding each other. Their lungs filled with water. Even at the end, they refused to let go. The coroner determined drowning was the cause, but hypothermia had shut down their bodies first. The strange way they were found suggested they died at almost the same moment. Cat's Cave Incident. On the 29th of December, 1980, 7 kids were looking for adventure during Christmas break. They gathered at a sandstone cliff near Ben Lomond in California. It was a gray, damp winter day after weeks of steady rain. The cliff rose about 200 feet. Near the top was Cat's Cave, a shallow rock shelter about 3 feet deep. Local kids had climbed up for years to carve their names in the soft sandstone. At 4 p.m., 2 boys decided to climb up. Sean Carson was 14 and Steve McGovern was 12. They reached the shallow shelter 200 feet up. Sean had brought a claw hammer. He planned to carve his name into the cave ceiling like kids before him. He raised the hammer and started pounding on the sandstone overhead. Steve watched and took a turn too. At approximately 4:15 p.m., there was a rumble. The cave ceiling let go. About 2 feet of sandstone fell. Sean Carson was buried completely under tons of rock. Steve McGovern was buried up to his chest but could breathe. He started screaming. The 5 kids at the base heard Steve's terrified voice. 3 climbed up immediately while 2 ran to call for help. The Ben Lomond Fire Department arrived in 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, both boys were freed. Steve was uninjured, not a scratch on him. Sean was under 2 feet of debris with no pulse. He wasn't breathing. An ambulance rushed him to the hospital with medics performing CPR, but doctors declared the 14-year-old boy dead.